Hello, friends, and welcome back to another episode of the Liberty Weekly podcast. I'm your host, as always, Patrick McFarland. This one is episode 232, and the show notes may be found at libertywweekly.net/232. And returning to the show is Hunter DeRensis. Hunter is the editor at the Libertarian Institute. He's the communications director for Bring Our Troops Home, bringourtroopshome.us, and a regular contributor at the American Conservative magazine. Hunter, welcome back, man.
Hi, Patrick. Happy to be here. Miserable to be talking about the topic we are today.
Yes. And maybe I should measure my speech a little bit to make it sound less peppy and exciting, but it's always great to talk to you. I just saw
Likewise.
you at the Ron Paul conference in D.C., and that was a fun time.
Yeah, it's always great when we can get together and, the Libertarian Institute, gets a little less remote and a little more together. It's always fun.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. And I've been glad to do a lot of stuff in person this summer. So, we are talking about one of the most important articles that you've written. However, this wasn't written recently. It was a couple of years ago. But this is about the Johnny Gosch case. And more largely, we're going to be focusing on Johnny Gosch in this episode, but more largely just about the Franklin scandal, which was I think one of the most well-documented child trafficking cases that made kind of a mainstream splash throughout the 80s and the early 90s. So I guess I know we want to do more of a conversational format here, but where did you first hear about this and what made you decide to write about it?
So I first heard about this when it was discussed on a very, very old episode of the Tim Dillon Show, back when the show was called Tim Dillon is Going to Hell. And Tim, who's these days a very well-known comedian, he's really, really gone viral, was much more interested in talking about conspiracy theories and sort of the underhanded channels of upper class society and government. And one day he did an episode on the Johnny Gosch case and touched on the Franklin scandal. And he actually started regularly interviewing a fellow named Nick Bryant, who's a journalist and the author of a book called The Franklin Scandal, a story of power brokers, child abuse, and betrayal. And that sort of touched off my interest of they were talking about this book and this documentary called Who Took Johnny. And, I sort of had to sit down for myself, watch the documentary, and that really sparked an interest in this case of like, oh, wow. To quote the Tim's episode title, this ain't great. And just going on from there of down the rabbit hole, researching it and deciding I want to write my own article on it. And I wrote a piece on it, sort of some very similar content that you'd find in the documentary Who Took Johnny, which I believe came out in 2014. And I interviewed Nick Bryant and I interviewed the documentary filmmaker and sort of describing the Johnny Gosch case, how it connects with the Franklin scandal. And that came out in early September of 2019, I believe, or no, 2020, which was the 38-year anniversary. And actually, just this month, as we're speaking, is the 40-year anniversary of the Johnny Gosch kidnapping. So it's still very timely, and a lot of local media in Iowa have done some anniversary reports on it, still discussing the case, which is still an open missing person report. But that's what really got me started and really hooked my interest. And, I just felt it was really important that, I want to contribute something because I had never heard of this. And I want people who might read me or follow my articles to learn about this, just, dip their toe in the water and maybe go and do some research themselves, because it's such a terrible, demonic thing that it's really easy to just want to ignore it in your life, these kind of issues. But I think awareness is important. And the more people that read that article will read that article now or listen to this episode, I think the better.
Yeah, and we'll include a link to your article in the show notes page. I'll put it up on screen here for those who are watching the video version. At the American Conservative, the child sex trafficking the child sex trafficking scandal that America forgot. And that's up there at the American Conservative.
And absolutely full credit to the great editors at the American Conservative who took this submission on this topic. If I remember correctly, did not change a single word of my draft. You don't get that from every publication. You don't get that from, every publisher that, especially something as respected and mainstream as the American Conservative, the fact that they were willing to tackle this issue, publish that, full credit to them. And I'm extremely grateful because you don't find that often.
Well, and this really touches on something that we were talking about before we hit the record button, which is I find this case especially interesting because you had the Satanic Panic, like in the 1980s, where these stories with the satanic rituals and ritual child abuse and pedophilia were popping up all over the place. And some of it seemed like a moral panic, possibly. But this one was grounded a lot more in actual facts. And you had investigations, you had court cases, you had testimony, and you had those kind of insurers of truth to like a sieve to take the testimony and the evidence and put it through. And we have a lot of kind of a revival of this going on, not so much in the popular consciousness right now. And you touch on this in your article talking about Jeffrey Epstein and the Pizzagate stuff that went around within the last, I think, 6 years. And it really seems like the Johnny Gosch case is this gray area in the middle between serious, because child sex trafficking is something like in law school, there were people, it was a big public interest issue that people were getting involved in. And it's taken very seriously, of course. It's institutionalized at least in combating child sex trafficking. So on the one hand, you have conspiracy theory, and on the other hand, you have the institutional forces that are taking this very seriously. And in the middle, you have the Johnny Gosch story. So any thoughts on that?
I think you're completely correct. I think one of the things that's so enticing about the Johnny Gosch case and what gets people interested as there's something here that's not right, I want to look into more, is because it doesn't check the normal boxes when it comes to this. If we're going statistically, the idea of stranger danger generally is not real. Overwhelmingly, I believe it's over 95% of cases where a child is getting sexually molested or abused, it's happening at the hands of the parents or another relative or someone who's in that child's life regularly and who's a trusted figure. The idea of random kidnappings and sort of strangers abusing children statistically is highly improbable, extremely rare. That's what makes the Johnny Gosch case so remarkable, because you have an instance where the circumstances, a paper boy, a 12-year-old paper boy named Johnny Gosch, is kidnapped during his paper route in the early morning hours in September 1982. There were witnesses who see him walking, doing his paper route, and being followed by a car and then a stranger. People hear a door slam, and Johnny is gone, leaving his red wagon full of undelivered newspapers and his dog Gretchen just on the sidewalk. And his parents only become aware of it very shortly after, when they start getting phone calls saying, "Hey, where's my paper? Johnny never delivered it. What's going on here?" The dad goes searching for it and discovers the wagon, and they immediately contact the authorities. So at the very minimum, you have a case, before we get into any of the larger issues or any of the other connections to Johnny Gosch, that you have a case where a young boy was kidnapped right off the street by strangers. What happened to him afterwards has been, part of discussion and theories, and I'm sure, and we're going to delve into that. But just right off the bat, you have an instance where that stranger danger did happen, and you can't refute it. And that's, I think, it's the eponymous question from the documentary: who took Johnny? This was a boy. He was taken. Who did it? That's what we try to figure out, because it's not something that you can just dismiss as part of that. So I think it is a perfect crossroads between these issues of, if people want to say derogatively, conspiracy theories versus the very real and serious and ongoing issue of child sex trafficking.
Yeah, it is. And it seems like it was a marker of the end of free range parenting, like the beginning of the end. It seems like it to me in the early 80s there. And of course, people like my parents who, they were born in the mid to late 60s. They still remember being free range raised during that era of the 70s. And then they were in high school in the early 80s. So still it was happening, go out in the morning, come home at dark kind of thing when mom rings the dinner bell or something.
Exactly. And the 80s were a period where these issues were not widely known. I mean, it's a big effect on the Johnny Gosch case right after he's taken, that the police do nothing. The morning it happens, it takes them 45 minutes to finally arrive at the house, even though they're only 10 blocks away. And their first question to his parents, Noreen and John Sr., are, has your son ever run away before? That's their immediate indication. Just treat this as another runaway case. And it was law in Iowa at the time to wait 72 hours before beginning a search for a missing child, because the presumption was just, oh, they're out late, they're doing something, they ran away. There was no indication that there was some sort of nefarious actors in this. And due to the efforts of Noreen and John Gosch, they got that law changed in Iowa in 1984 that it was now required that police immediately begin looking for children as soon as they go missing. And that became the national standard. But at the time, most people had never heard the word pedophile. The idea of, adults nabbing kids off the street, it wasn't even in the public social consciousness. So it was instances of the Johnny Gosch kidnapping and similar ones like it that occurred in the 80s that really woke the public up to this danger and really made it more of a widespread idea, where today we are, as a society, much more aware of these issues. And some would even say more, unduly paranoid about it from some points of view. For instance, Johnny Gosch was only the second child to ever appear on a milk carton. And, that's a very well-known staple today, that idea of pre-internet looking for missing kids. So the Johnny Gosch case really changed a lot in the public consciousness, not just in Iowa, but nationally as well.
Or this idea of an Amber Alert too. Is that something that's a national thing, isn't it? An Amber Alert?
I'm not sure off the top of my head. It may well be.
Okay, but you've heard of it. I mean,
certainly.
Okay, yeah. So, and I remember, we get Amber Alerts on our phones. It buzzes and pops up, and it has the details of a vehicle or some kind of license plate number.
Yep, same here.
I thought so. Going to the instance of the kidnapping versus runaway, it seemed like there was evidence that no one would take to assume that Johnny was a runaway, right? I'm sure, as a police officer, you get these false alarms a lot, I would guess, maybe, but they come to this just assuming that he's a runaway. They take their sweet time, but his wagon was left there, his paper route was abandoned, and his dog was left too. And I mean, Johnny had never been a kid that would run away or there wasn't a fight between Johnny and his parents. There was nothing that would be a precursor to a runaway or instigate a runaway situation. What kind of dog would what kind of child would run away, a boy, and leave their dog? Doesn't make any sense at all.
Mm-hmm. Nothing was packed. Nothing was prepped. He was witnessed by other paper boys and by an adult resident of the neighborhood doing his paper route, walking with his wagon, going around a corner, and then gone, completely vanished. This was absolutely not a case of a runaway, and I don't think anyone would dispute that today, even though officially the law considers Johnny Gosch to be a missing person. There's no technical crime associated with this case on the books, which is remarkable in and of itself, but I don't think any reasonable person would say that Johnny Gosch was anything but taken.
So I guess to walk people through the story, after there's a big search, there's a lot of people that are mobilized, but it is the Gosches themselves that have to do the organizing for the search.
Yes, they put in so much legwork, and it's what you'd hope that any parents would do, and especially the labor that Noreen Gosch has put in and has continued to put in. I mean, this woman is still actively searching for her son 40 years later and putting in this effort and is not forgotten. I mean, it's such a heart-wrenching story to witness what a mother's love and a mother's determination is willing to go through for this sort of case. But at the time in 1982, when Johnny was taken, there was no infrastructure for this. It was not very much on the police's radar. There was no nonprofit infrastructure or private organizations that were dedicated to the searching for children. And it was actually later in the 80s, through the help of John Sr. and Noreen Gosh, that we do get federal agencies who are specifically targeting child sex trafficking and investigating the sort of disappearances that affected this family. But at the time, there was nothing like that. So you did have to just rely on the parents caring so much about their missing child to put in the effort to organize their own search parties, put up a reward, do the legwork, collect the evidence, because the police are not interested, would rather treat it as a runaway. It's not a primary concern. Certainly, it's not making the department any money. I mean, this conversation and this topic is as much about police incompetence and just police indifference as much as it is child sex trafficking, in my opinion.
And I think it is an interesting thing because, you know, I guess from a libertarian angle, it's like, well, we're against the state, but somebody has to investigate these child sex trafficking, you know, missing children issues. Somebody has to do it. And
as long as there is a monopoly on force and that we have police who claim to want to do this job, they should be made to do their job.
Exactly. Yes, precisely. And this is where the conspiracy comes in a little bit, Hunter, because you have the police chief, and his name is Orville Cooney. Yes, and he calls off the search for Johnny, but he also comes out again publicly against Johnny's mother a little bit later when Noreen is really holding the fire to the investigation. But then he gets into some trouble where is he fired or he resigns? He's compelled to resign after there's an investigation that he is involved in drinking on the job and fixing tickets, and he's a racist, which comes out as well. And so the most simple explanation, the most benign one, is just that, well, he was a piece of crap. Another explanation is that, well, he was threatened or he was in on it or something like. I mean, there's no evidence that I've seen to say that he is. But I'm sure that people have made that claim or have at least speculated about that.
I'm sure as well. I also believe the benign explanation. I think it is just a case of a bastard cop not doing his job well and then becoming very annoyed when a willful and abrasive mother keeps contacting him, asking about her son and why he's not doing more. He blows up to the media about her saying, frankly, I'm sick of Noreen Gosh. I don't really care about this. You know, she needs to let us do our job and shut up. Huge public backlash to that, as there should be. And then an investigation is conducted. They find these things, which I guess you could also make the argument, you know, how much of this is he's really, you know, drinking on the job and fixing tickets and all this stuff versus how much they're just looking for an excuse to get rid of this guy who's become a major PR nightmare. But no, I do believe the Occam's razor, benign explanation. This is just a really bad cop who's bad at his job, does not care about this issue. And that just leads to, you know, the tragic consequences of not enough resources being committed to look for Johnny Gosh.
Yeah. And from my perspective, being a practicing attorney, there's another element that we got a picture of at the Ron Paul conference. Actually, there was a speech given by a reporter who I forget which outlet she was from. It was a Washington-based outlet.
I think the Washington Times.
Yeah, and I my apologies, I'm not remembering her name, but she was talking about some of the non-conspiratorial forces that would prevent people from covering stories of major interest, specifically stories of corruption and things like that. And it's that everyone wants to go along to get along. And no one wants to be that hard-nosed, abrasive person that goes around and makes a hard time for colleagues or is investigating these public committees or school boards or things like that. Now, when you have a personal stake in the issue, that may change. But sometimes you have to have a personality of someone who really wants to get in there and solve these issues and isn't afraid to hurt feelings and you know, get involved and possibly rub people the wrong way. And I mean, as an attorney too, you're a colleague of people in your profession. And there's a very fine line between being an asshole and being a pushover where you're really advocating for your client, but it's not, it's nothing personal or a vendetta or just being a jerk about it.
Mm-hmm. Especially when that client is your missing child.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. I can't even imagine, I have 2 young kids myself, and especially reading through this just like twists your guts and makes you feel ill. Just imagining your precious child in this situation. It just is sickening. And I can't imagine what Noreen went through this whole process. So the case goes cold a little bit until, is it around 1991 where there's a break? And what is that break? So
the break is, and I apologize, I can't remember if it was 89 or 91. I think you're correct. Okay. 1991 is when a man named Paul Benassi, who I believe in 91 is 24 years old, he comes forward and he claims that he was involved in the kidnapping of Johnny Gosch. Paul Benassi at the time is imprisoned in a state prison in Nebraska, charged and convicted for molesting his younger cousin. And he claims that when he was 15, that he participated in the kidnapping of Johnny Gosch against his will. Paul Benassi, this is a man who was sexually abused himself from the age of, I read conflicting ages, either the age of 6 or the age of 9, but did severe damage to his psyche. He has been diagnosed and confirmed diagnosis of multiple personality disorder. And he claimed in 1991, while in prison, that he participated in the kidnapping, that he was the first person to molest Johnny Gosch on camera to be sold as child pornography for predators. And this creates a huge explosion in the case, at least for Noreen Gosch, who goes to Nebraska, speaks to Paul, and decides very definitively that he is telling the truth. He knew my son. He has information that he could not have known otherwise. And that ranges from identifying minor markings on Johnny's body to identifying idiosyncratic behavior that no one else probably would have known. And Noreen becomes very convinced of Paul's involvement. And he's interviewed by some local media, but the police refuse to take an interest in it. According to them, there's nothing solidifying a connection between Paul Benassi and the Johnny Gosch kidnapping. And the Iowa police and the local police never interview him to this day. And since then, Paul has been, he got out of prison. He's married, has his own family, has tried to move on past his own demons, but has never spoken on the record to the authorities because they frankly refuse to interview him. But this is the single break in the case. And what makes the big connection is that Paul Benassi was one of a half dozen people, young adults, who claimed that as teenagers, they were forced to participate in a child sex trafficking ring located in Omaha, Nebraska. Which that became known as the Franklin scandal, which I'm sure we'll going to get into.
Yeah, one of the interesting things too is you said there's I think a 2014 documentary called "Who Took Johnny," and Paul,
which I recommend everyone watch.
Yes,
it's one of the best documentaries I have ever seen because it's going to present you with information that goes beyond the limits of this podcast to just make you view the world in an entirely different and much worse way.
Yeah, and it is, like I said, sickening at times too. And actually, we were talking at the beginning about when we first heard of this story, and I think I heard about it first around the time this documentary came out, 2014 or 2015, because I mean, long-time listeners of this podcast will know that I've dabbled in conspiracy on this show in the very beginning, maybe within the first year or so of it. And there's Conspiracy of Silence is another documentary that has been banned. And there's a story behind that too. And we'll get into some of the more sinister aspects of this case. But I think, was it John DeCamp himself who was involved in the Conspiracy of Silence documentary?
I believe he might have been interviewed for it. Conspiracy of Silence was a 1993 documentary that was being produced by a British production company for the Discovery Network here in the United States. They filmed a significant amount of material, did a lot of prep. It was in production, but then the Discovery Channel canceled their order, said, we don't want anything to do with this documentary, shelve this, forget it, never mind. And you can actually go watch Conspiracy of Silence, the original, unaired, still a little choppy, but decently well produced for a documentary that was, cut mid-production. You can view their final product on YouTube right now for free. That's Conspiracy of Silence 1993, which, along with Who Took Johnny, I recommend everyone view for an even more full picture, because that documentary includes a lot of face-to-face interviews with a lot of the victims of the Franklin scandal. You see Paul Benassi, you see a lot of the other young adults and teens who were abused, and you can get a much more fuller picture, not just of the Johnny Gosch kidnapping, but primarily the Franklin scandal.
And in John D. Camp, I think that Paul Bonacci was his client, because
Correct.
he was he a state senator, or was he actually like in the House, like the National House?
John D. Camp, well, he was a Vietnam veteran and attorney who served for several years as a state senator in the Nebraska legislature, and was one of the state senators involved in the inquiry investigating the Franklin Credit Union scandal and the Franklin sexual abuse scandal. And after his retirement from the state Senate, he wrote a book on it. I think you might have the title on hand. It escapes me, but he wrote a book on it that's become very popular and continued to speak out about the Franklin scandal. And you're correct, represented Paul Benassi through several civil suits in the 1990s, and I believe passed away 5-6 years ago. Oh,
okay. Yeah, it's the Franklin cover-up is Child Abuse, Satanism, and Murder in Nebraska by John W. D. Camp. So I think, of course, that quality is one of the things that gives this case a lot more credibility. The fact that, as a member of the bar, you have certain obligations, you have certain ethical standards that apply to you as an attorney. And of course, I say this a lot there. The biggest cardinal sin of being a lawyer is lying or fraud or misplacing your client's money. And I think that if, at the very least, his involvement in that, and I'm not saying that every attorney is of the best moral quality, but I'm just saying there are safeguards to that effect. And he's a credible figure, this John D. Camp. And Paul Bonacci's credibility, you can evaluate yourself by watching these documentaries and watching I guess the on video testimony that he gives. There's no court testimony, but you can evaluate him yourself. He looks like someone who's troubled, who I believe that he was abused just based on his appearance. He looks like someone that has demons.
Absolutely. And yeah, it's up to each individual to judge whether or not they believe Paul Benassi and his testimony. It's an ongoing problem, not just with the Franklin scandal case, but really so many cases of child sex trafficking, where it is made a point to, when people are taken, and I'll probably clarify here that I think there's a common misconception when it's discussed of child sex trafficking. When people say child, I think most of us, or the layman, immediately thinks of a 6-year-old, an 8-year-old being abused. The average age of a person being sex trafficked is 15 years old. So above the age of puberty, but certainly underage, a young teenager. And so that's the predominant group that's being affected by this. And it's very common in these cases where the predators, the people who are taking these children, are giving them drugs or getting them hooked. One, to make them much more docile and being able to better control them with substance abuse, but also to inhibit help produce those behaviors later in life, which comes from drug addiction. That many of these people who were abused young, due to the drug abuse, due to the psychological damage of that molestation, do end up having some sort of criminal careers, do end up being drug addicts, do end up having the sorts of lives and the perception by society that makes them more difficult to believe. That is a purposeful strategy by abusers and by predators to not only make their victims easier to victimize, but to make it more difficult for them to come forward in the future against their abusers. So yes, Paul Benassi is a child molester himself and was convicted of it. He is someone who suffers from multiple personality disorder. And all of these effects, which might have some people say, well, we can't believe him, he's not credible because of these things. Those are exactly the things that are added evidence that he suffered this abuse, because that's what happens. And I think that's something that people really need to realize when looking at the testimonies of these victims, from not only Benassi, but the other victims of the Franklin scandal, and even victims today of child sex trafficking, that these are troubled folks because they've gone through troubles. And, it's not going to be easy for someone to come up and, be spick and span and totally clean and say, oh, yeah, the most traumatic thing imaginable happened to me. And see, I'm, here in a suit and I look perfectly fine and I'm an upstanding member of society. That's not what happens. And it's not a standard that we should hold these victims to.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to the portion of the show where I tell you how you can help support this content. It is at my new membership website, libertyweekly.club. And I know I've been announcing this, but I left Substack, rolled out a new membership website that operates the same way. You get content through your email address, but there's also a web page, libertyweekly.club, where you can go and read the articles. And it works really great so far. Just a couple of hiccups in terms of trying to figure out how to use free previews for people who are just signed up to the free newsletter. And for people who sign up through the membership here, you can see that right now I have a $5 a month tier that will get you access to early access to episodes of Liberty Weekly, access to bonus episodes that I've been trying to come out with 2 times a month, preprint access to all my Libertarian Institute articles before they're published. And I'm working on setting up a subscribers only live stream. I'd like to do that before the end of the month, which I will announce through the email list. So if you go through, sign up for the email list, libertyweekly.club, hit the subscribe button. You can choose the free tier or you could choose the $5 per month tier, which will get you access to the benefits. But for free content, there still is free content up there. Like I do a lot of article content there. So head on over to libertyweekly.club. The other thing that I'm really excited to announce is a collaboration between myself and Ludwig von Mises Pieces, which is the guy who does all my graphics and thumbnails, and the guy who, he does a ton of awesome work. So you can see Liberty Weekly merch is now available. If you head on over to libertyweekly.net this time /merch, MERCH, you'll be able to find Liberty Weekly merch with my new logo with the rising sun and Lady Liberty holding the shield and flag. I really like the logo that he was able to do for me. And you can see that you can get coffee mugs there. You can get sweatshirt. You can get t-shirts and all that kind of stuff. The other collaboration. Oh, and if you use promo code LW10, that will get you 10% off. And it will also get a kickback to me and show him that you bought through my link. But you could also go through all the other merchandise that he has there. There's lots of good stuff. You buy anything in the store with promo code LW10, and I will also get a kickback. You can see a bunch of stickers and t-shirts and designs that people in our sphere of the Liberty movement will just love all that, the merch that he has there. It's original stuff that he's made himself. And we did a collaboration on a t-shirt, that idea that I had, Dissolve NATO, super timely right now. But for those of you just listening to the audio version only, it's the NATO logo that is being shattered into a million pieces, and it says Dissolve NATO on it. So I think it's a really cool, timely t-shirt. Of course, it was an idea that I'd commissioned, and I think that he did an awesome job with it. And if you like my thumbnails and logo art, Ludwig von Mises Pieces did Why I Am Anti-War podcast logo, which is a dove coming out of a helmet. And I really, really like that logo too. So check out this Dissolve NATO. You can get it in sticker format. You can get it on a sweatshirt or a t-shirt. And I'm going to be picking some of these up myself because I think they turned out really awesome. So again, head on over to libertyweekly.net/merch. And to get the NATO t-shirt, head on over to libertyweekly.net/NATO, NATO. All right. So that's all the stuff I got for you guys this week's. Thanks everyone for subscribing, all the members at libertyweekly.club. Really appreciate it. You really help me afford all the hosting costs and to upgrade my equipment and all that kind of stuff too. So, all right. Thanks. Peace. One thing that's so interesting too is if you've ever, I haven't defended any kind of abuse case, like defended a client from abuse charges in court. But one thing that becomes apparent in the criminal defense bar is the ruthlessness with which the police pursue these charges. And I think that it's just so strange to see something that could possibly be a huge organized network remain uninvestigated, knowing how ruthlessly the police do pursue charges against the uncle who, touches the niece or something like that. I guess it's just interesting.
I think, and that really opens up the question of it depends on who's the predator. It depends on who's committing these crimes. That is so dependent on whether or not the police are investigating and then prosecuting to the fullest effect. The uncle that molests their niece is a very, it's a slam dunk for a local police force and a local DA to go after that person. But when it's someone with influence, when it's someone who's donated significant money to, the local police union, when it's someone who's a publicly known member of that community in high standing, who's well connected to other people, local political leaders, local business leaders, that makes it a much more difficult case and makes the incentive much, much different to say, well, maybe this case isn't exactly what it seems. Maybe this alleged victim is making it up. Maybe they are just troubled and are, speaking out against something that, might not have happened. And, that's sort of what this is, because I mentioned at the end of my article, I wanted to make sure to end it with a consistent list of these sort of situations, because I think it's very easy for people to dismiss what happened in isolation of like, you're saying that there's networks of sexual predators and pedophiles. All right, don't you think we would have heard stuff about this? But we do. This is what, even before the Epstein case, which really blew this whole subject out of the water, you have cases with the Catholic Church abuse scandals, where for decades there was systemic abuse within the church, and you have local dioceses helping cover it up, move priests around, because it's considered easier than actually having to do something about it, and it'd be a huge public scandal for the church. I'm originally from Altoona, Pennsylvania, 45 minutes south of State College and Penn State University, where for years there was a cover-up in the football department against one of the coaches who was molesting students and young boys because it would be considered an embarrassment to the school and to the sports program. We hear stories all the time of Telford and other cities in the United Kingdom where for decades thousands and thousands of young British girls were molested, abused, and trafficked by Pakistani immigrants and other men of their ilk. And it was well known to the police, who decided it was best not to do anything because the scandal and the possible racial recriminations would be too large, that it wouldn't be worth it. So we see that these things happen in our society. We see that there is not just random individual abducting a child from Chuck E. Cheese, but there is and exists organized networks of predators in this country and around the world who abuse children, help others of their kind abuse children, and work in these systems to kidnap and traffic these children. It's a reality that we need to understand, identify, and be willing to be made aware of. That's why I end the article by asking the question that every person who reads that article, every person who watches those documentaries, every person who listens to this podcast has to sit down and ask themselves, do I believe in evil? And do I believe such things are possible? And once you come to the realization of that, well, then you're left with, what do I do now?
Yeah, right. What does one do? And this is, I don't think we mentioned Larry King yet, and his involvement there. And so this is where some of the connections get, and you alluded to, what do you do when your investigation leads to someone that is in a place of power? And so the actual Franklin scandal part of it is there was this charity or this was it an orphan house called Boys Town where much of the young wards there were being abused by Larry King, or being pimped out in a sense by Larry King and sent to, the allegation is, to participate in these satanic rituals and satanic ritual abuse, with connections going up all the way to the top of the United States government.
Yes. Lawrence E. King was a local businessman in Omaha, Nebraska. He was president and chairman of the of the Franklin Federal Credit Union, which had significant local ties to business and political relations and media relations. Lawrence King was an up-and-coming member of the Republican Party elite. He was a very well-regarded singer. He actually sang the national anthem at the 1984 Republican National Convention. He was the head of one of the auxiliary organizations of the Republican Party, promoting the Republican Party among black voters and other minorities, himself being a black man. And he was considered a very well-regarded member of his community and such. And yes, I sent this to you, what's on the screen right now, where after everything that happened, after it came out that he had embezzled millions and millions of dollars from the credit union, after it came out that he was a closeted gay man with accusations from half a dozen boys and girls, including Paul Benassi, that Larry King had abused them, raped them, taken them on planes to child sex parties in Washington, D.C., in New York and other major cities, and made them have sexual relations with other prominent members of business, media, industry, politics. And after he is convicted and serves a 10-year sentence on the minimum embezzlement charges, he moves to Northern Virginia, finds a home in Reston, and reinvents himself, and is pretty well accepted in the elite community of Northern Virginia, home of semi-relevant, the military-industrial complex. But the people who live there welcomed Larry King with open arms. He becomes, involved in the local opera society and these other nonprofits, and is just able to continue living his life in this. I don't have words for it, Patrick, that you're able to do all of this and still be able to just be a member of high society. I think it really speaks to something terribly sick about, if not our society in general, at the very least about the elites in our society, that this is able to happen.
Well, there was some really spooky things that were going on involved with the investigation of this matter. And one of them, and I'm sorry, I don't have a more firm grasp on the details, but there was an investigator in the Attorney General's office who had been on the trail of this and had a bunch of evidence, including pictures and documents. And he took a single engine propeller plane that he was flying with his son and I forget what his destination and departure point were from, but the plane just disintegrates in midair, and all the evidence, including his briefcase containing all of his evidence and investigation materials, are missing.
Correct. A fellow by the name of Dory. Forgive me, I can't remember his first name at the moment, but a fellow named Dory. He was a former Nebraska state trooper. He is tasked by the Senate Special Investigatory Committee in Nebraska, the state senators who are investigating the Franklin Federal Credit Union for embezzlement when the accusations of child molestation and child sex trafficking come out. And they task Dory with, hey, go around, look into this. You're a former state trooper. You're working as a private eye. We trust you as someone with experience to go to the victims, look this up, find what you can dig up to present it to the Senate committee. He does this. He collects dozens of hours of interview tape with the victims and with people associated with the credit union, with Boys Town, with the situation. And he collects a mountain of evidence and information related to all this, and including a very long witness list that he's able to speak to. And while on search for what he claimed and what it's been claimed since then were actual photos of these child sex parties that Larry King was bringing these children to in D.C. and New York, he flies himself along with his young son on a single engine plane flying through the Midwest, where the official story, I use the word disintegrate in the article. I couldn't find a better synonym, but the official story, this is the official one, is that while flying, Dory's plane spontaneously began falling apart. So you can imagine a plane flying and pieces just start falling off until it crashes. Dory and his son are killed. His briefcase is never recovered. And the allegation is that his plane was either shot down, tampered with in some way. There was a bomb on board because he had in his possession these photos, which would act as definitive proof against Larry King and other prominent members of this child sex trafficking ring. It's not known definitively whether or not these pictures existed, whether they were in Dory's possession, or really what happened with the plane. But what we do know is that his very unexpected and sudden and mysterious death contributed to the witnesses and the victims revoking their testimony. As I mentioned earlier, 6 people came forward, Paul Benassi being one of them. 4 of them revoked their testimony and said, never mind, didn't happen. I'm all of my testimony before the special prosecutor, forget it. 2 of them, Alicia Owens and Paul Benassi, did not revoke their testimony. They were charged with perjury. Alicia Owens was convicted of it, served several years in prison in solitary confinement, I might add. So practically a torture sentence for this young woman who came forward to talk about her sexual abuse. And it was the official opinion by the special investigator after Dory's death and all of this that the allegations of child sex trafficking and sexual abuse were, to quote them, a carefully crafted hoax. That was their conclusion. Now, the interesting thing is the report does not deny that Benassi and the other victims were sexually molested. It doesn't question that. The only thing it says is that we don't believe that their predators and their abusers were the people they named, which is...
It doesn't make sense.
Doesn't make any sense to say that, okay, we have half a dozen people come forward. We agree that they're victims. We agree they were abused, but we don't believe them that it was these people. That was what they believed was a carefully crafted hoax. But even despite that conclusion, Larry King was charged and convicted on the embezzlement, along with some violating some anti-homosexuality law. So confirmed he was gay and participating in that. And Nick Bryant, the journalist and author of The Franklin Scandal, the book I mentioned previously, is in possession of a large majority of Dory's evidence, and that's included in his book. But it's one of those things where it's, I don't have an explanation for Dory's death except the obvious. And I'm not sure if anyone else would really look at that and be very satisfied besides with, yeah, something happened here that's weird to say the least. I mean, it's there, when you get into the conclusions of this case and how things were left at the end of the 80s, it's amazing that anyone was satisfied with this conclusion. And many of the state senators, including John DeCamp, who were on the Senate committee, were not satisfied with the special investigation and the conclusions of that. And that's why they continue to speak out about the Franklin scandal, even after it sort of wrapped itself up.
And one of the other, I was going to add this is my dad is a pilot, or he had his not a commercial license, but a private license. And so we had a plane for a while. And one thing that you learn growing up, that if you have your pilot's license, you do a pre-flight check before you go on any kind of trip. And I'm sure that if Dory had his pilot's license, which he did if he was, flying his own private plane, he did a pre-flight check to check everything. So, and I think
especially with his son on board.
Well, of course, yeah. And one thing DeCamp mentions is that one thing that he does mention in his book is that some witnesses reported hearing an explosion. That's what I recall from reading the book. But so there's another part about this too, is that adds to Bonacci's credibility, is that he says there's this house in Colorado where a lot of these fellow witnesses of his were being held at for some period of time. And he was able to, he described the house, then he took investigators there. The house matched his description. So he actually took the investigators to the house. Before they went there, said that there was a chamber under a crawl space or some chamber underneath the house where the kids were held, where there were initials that were carved into the wood. And he actually took investigators there. They looked under the house. They found this crawl space. They found carvings that corroborated what he had said. And so that is another layer of just really interesting corroboration to support what he says.
It's an instance you just want to rip your hair out as you're watching this. You're completely correct. This was investigators associated with America's Most Wanted, who wanted to do an episode on the Johnny Gosch kidnapping, spoke to Paul Bonacci, who, you're correct, described this location in Colorado, this building that housed these kidnapped and trafficked children. They go to Colorado following Bonacci's description and connections, and they find it, and they find that crawl space. And it is claimed by one of the producers that there were initials carved into the wood in the basement. And I asked the documentary filmmaker for my article, I asked him, well, the description for this is that they were children's signatures or children's markings. How can you identify that, or how can you be sure? And the way he put it to me was that it was the way they were drawn sort of in a rudimentary fashion, in that it appeared childlike, because that was one of my primary questions related to that. And America's Most Wanted claimed the person who owned this had long since disappeared. I don't know what that word means. Right. It
was a dead end, they said.
Exactly. There's nothing to go off of. But just the fact that you're finding this building with a huge, horrifying looking basement, exactly as was described, as this person who says, I was sex trafficked here. This is where we brought Johnny Gosch after we kidnapped him. I mean, you start looking around wondering, am I the crazy one for being so interested in what's going on here? Am I the crazy one for asking, why isn't this front page news? Why isn't this being talked about all the freaking time? Like, why is this, some random episode of America's Most Wanted in the early 90s and not like, on 60 Minutes right freaking now? Again, there's so many parts of this story that just leave you speechless, because you don't even know what to do when you're presented with this sort of information.
Right. And it departs a little bit from like some other things that I've heard, and I don't know how much you've looked into this, Hunter. I think I've mentioned it on the show a few times, but there's this other theory of, satanic ritual abuse, where you'll go on BitChute or Odyssey or something and watch documentaries that people do. And and it bleeds over to this more out there world of monarch mind control. I don't know if you've heard of this theory where there's a CIA program that they talk about, and I don't think there's any documentation for this, but they talk about it as if it's fact, where the CIA or other entities, the elites, will grab people and they purposely they mind control people through splintering their identities through ritual abuse and drugs. And some of it rings true in terms of it's very similar to what the story is presented by these victims in the Johnny Gosch case and the Franklin scandal case. But it really, I don't know. It's like there's so much less evidence to support that than there are here. But then again, you do have these people who it's impossible to evaluate their credibility, where they come forward and they go on podcasts and they say, well, I'm fourth generation child of a Satanist family, and I grew up in the satanic elite world, and this and this and that happened to me. And it's just so hard to know what's true and what isn't. Whereas this story has those indicia of truthfulness because it's been put through investigations by credible people and court proceedings.
I think I'll handle this in two parts. The first part is mind control. I think that word is so loaded with preconceptions that it makes it very difficult. I mean, we know, and it's indisputable, that the CIA and other elements of our government attempted a program that we would consider mind control, and that they consider the potential for mind control through MK Ultra, where they believed through systemic drugging of people with LSD and other substances that they could be trained and controlled and manipulated. Now, this was not successful. It just seriously damaged people's psyches without any of the potential manipulation. As I discussed earlier, we know that it's a common tactic by serial abusers and these sort of predators involved in child sex trafficking to get their victims hooked on drugs, create that dependency, and make them easier to manipulate. That is correct. Someone who has a substance addiction and that you are providing them for it makes it much easier for you to bend them to their will. That's true, and that sort of manipulation does happen, and that sort of sustained drug use can seriously warp someone's psyche. To suddenly make the jump, though, to describe it as mind control, I think is too much of a stretch to describe this very real phenomenon. I don't know particularly about the monarch mind control or the specificity of that, but and the second part I would get into when it comes to the Satanism angle. I think a lot of people like to focus on the Satanism angle because it's a sexy angle, it's a flashy angle, it gets your attention. It certainly grabs the minds of a lot of conservatives who have, for good and for ill, have gotten very interested in the topic of child sex trafficking in the past few years. I think while it's there, it is such a side issue. Like, people want to focus on, well, are they abusing these children as sacrifices? Are there bloodletting ceremonies? Are they wearing, goat skulls as they abuse them? Really all beside the point of, they're being abused. Isn't the child sexual abuse bad enough? Do we have to raise it to the level of it's all for Satan as well? Like, I'm a firm believer that there are significant percentages of our ruling elite who are evil, outright evil, to a level of Satanism. I mean, we go to the Alex Jones video of Bohemian Grove, and they're all worshiping Moloch and a giant owl statue. Whether that is drunk festivities of just a bunch of, old frat guys who are doing that for a lark, or whether it is a much more serious thing that is there, that's an aspect of our ruling class, that there is a percentage who are interested in things like this. But for the most part, I think the Satanism aspect is such a side issue, and I think it really gets people departed from the core of the story, which is that these organizations exist, that these networks of child sex trafficking exist, and that it's a problem. Whether they're doing it to worship the devil, we can figure that out later.
Yeah. it makes me think about I had Adam Fitzgerald on a few episodes ago, and I don't know if you met Adam just a week or two ago. He was the real tall guy from New York that specializes in 9/11, and he talks about, you know, how if you have something that is scandalous enough, right? This evidence that the Alphabet Soup agencies knew about Osama bin Laden and the hijackers, that they dropped the ball, didn't share communication, and you get 9/11 that happens. And then the 9/11 truth movement comes out with all these crazy conspiracies about holograms and missiles hitting the Pentagon and stuff like that. And what it really does is it poisons the well and detracts from what the real scandal is. And the real scandal is the Larry King investigation and these people that come forward, and the police refusal in some ways, to to really follow up on investigating this.
Yes, I think, and that's the problem with discussing these topics. I mean, we've mentioned Nick Bryant and John DeCamp, two very serious people, two very credible people who wrote very good books on this that contain a lot of useful information. And we're not talking about the countless dozens of other people and books that have been written on these issues that are frankly not credible and don't practice good journalism, and who do make this seem a lot more loony than it actually is. And that's why I think it's so important that and that's what I try to do in my article, keep it very grounded to just, this is what is definitively proven, definitively known. I didn't write in the article that, you know, a bomb blew up Dory's plane. I just wrote, his plane spontaneously fell apart. This is the official story. Reader, you can make your own conclusions on what happened here, but this is just what we know, and what we know leads you to conclusions that, you know, I think would not be very satisfactory to the mainstream media or significant parts of our government.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good place to kind of wrap things up here. This is just the tip of the iceberg of course, what you alluded to is a very, very large body of evidence and of narrative about exactly what happened and what people think what happened. I mean, the Johnny Gosch story is just one victim of this larger situation. So, yeah, well, thanks for coming on to talk about it. I know it's a difficult topic, and we got to be pretty nuanced with our analysis, but yes. I think if we stay with what we can say happened for sure, and be clear about when we're speculating, I think spreading awareness about this issue is a great thing.
Yes, it is a very difficult topic. I do encourage everyone to watch Who Took Johnny, read my article just to get maybe the full picture from this podcast. Going deeper than that, you're welcome to it. I couldn't do it. I wrote this article on the Johnny Gosch kidnapping, and then I followed it shortly up after, a few weeks later, doing a review of the Netflix movie Cuties, and how the idea of quote unquote child sexuality and all of this is not a new phenomenon, but has been propagated in the media for several decades. And after doing a very deep dive research on this topic, and then having to watch that movie and doing research on that, I emailed the editor at the American Conservative with my submission for the Cuties article. And I'm just like, this is going to be my last submission related to anything on the topic of child sexual abuse or anything like this. It's bad for my soul. Yeah. That was my conclusion. I could not go deeper than that. So if people are interested in getting more on the topic and doing good with that, Godspeed. That's all I can say.
Yeah. Well, for those of you with kids out there or children in your life that you know, in your family or anything like that, just make sure you have a good relationship with them and hug them tight. I guess don't be a snowplow or a helicopter parent, but just, I think, like you said, a lot of this has to do with someone, children who are abused are largely abused by people that they know. And so, and to prevent them from getting in those situations, have conversations with them and do what you can to be close and prevent that situation. All right. Well, you want to let people know where they can follow your work?
Sure. You can follow me on Twitter at Hunter DeRensis, DeRensis. There's a collection of all of my past published work on my website, hunterderensis.com. I apologize, it's very rudimentary, but if you just want a list of links, they're all there. And consider making a financial contribution to bring our troops home in our supporters group, the 10-7 Club. We work on foreign policy and speaking out for veterans issues and trying to end our endless wars in the Middle East, and make a financial contribution to the Libertarian Institute, which is always doing great things and employing great people like me and Patrick. You cannot go wrong with this and Scott Horton's project, so do what you can.
Yeah. Awesome, man. Well, it was great to have you on. I was going to say, I wanted to take a little bit of a break from all the doom and gloom of foreign policy and the China issue. And then
Patrick, next time you have me on, please, can we talk about the genocide in Yemen? Yeah. It is such a brighter topic than any of this. Please. Well,
we actually do need to talk more seriously about defend the guard and bring our troops home. Because I think, of course, that's incredibly important and something practical, a bit more practical. So, all right. Well, I thanks for coming on again, and I hope we talk soon.
Thanks, Patrick.